First of all, hello to our audience. My name's Bronner, and I'm co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, which is sponsoring this, what will become a set of podcasts dealing with the crisis. And I don't think that will become, and what crisis will become specified in each discussion. So we're going to kick off our podcast with one of my favorite people in the entire world, and that is Professor Frances Fox Piven, who has been a beacon of light for activists and scholars in the United States for as long as I can remember. She's a person who's had a great impact on me, and her books, just to name a few, Poor People's Movements and Regulating the Poor with her late husband, Richard Cloward, and her own books, Why Americans Don't Vote, which is, of course, relevant right now, and Ordinary People. And so, just using these, which have become standard works, let me introduce Frances Piven.
Hello, everybody. Glad for the chance to talk to you.
I think I think the best place to begin is with the coronavirus, and I should warn everyone that Frances is a profoundly political person, and that's how we're going to approach the issues that we talk about today. So, what do you see as the deepest impact of the coronavirus politically?
Well, probably the erosion of whatever confidence is left in leadership in the United States, at least. I think in other countries, the situation is quite different. Here, the mounting tolls in terms of death and just the contagion, the mounting tolls reflect directly on the Trump administration, which of course assured Americans repeatedly that it's nothing, it'll go away. In a couple of weeks, it'll be gone. You won't ever even remember it. Who massively misled the American public, and in an attempt to reassure them. But of course, you know, the guy is
I'm talking about Trump, you know.
Yeah, the guy is sort of a carnival artist, and it doesn't work so well when people are actually getting sick and dying, and they're the people you know. They're your relatives, your mother, your father, your what. So I think that Donald Trump is being taken down more than any other single factor by the coronavirus pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, Fred. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, I was going to say, you know, we've grown up theoretically always making a stark division between society and the natural sciences. At least that's true of new trends in Marxism, in critical theory, in the most radical trends that I can think of in theory. And it seems to me one of the interesting things is the way the virus is impacting on class and race. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, that's a reflection of, you know, actually health is never simply a scientific or a natural phenomenon. It's always partly a social phenomenon. It has to do with the kinds of supports you get, the kind of nutrition you get, and with the level of stress in your daily life, and with your exposure to pathogens as a result of the work you. So that division is only partly useful. only partly useful. And now it's turning out that the coronavirus is having its most severe impact on poorer people, on darker skinned people, on the people who are at the bottom of American society. These are also the people who continue to do what is called essential work in American society. Parts of our economy are still locked down, and more will be locked down because we have a new upsurge of the virus. But all other sorts of essential functions still go on. Moreover, the health care that the virus demands requires workers, all sorts of workers. And who does that work? Exactly the same people who are most vulnerable to the contagious effects of the coronavirus. So the virus is a kind of accentuator of class and racial divisions in the United States in a very bold, bold way. Moreover, it's occurring at the same time as I think the most remarkable movement yet in American history is occurring. Sometimes we call it the Black Lives Matter movement, but there, uh, over the last month or so, what has welled up in American society is something that's absolutely unprecedented in two ways. One is the reach of the movement. It's occurring everywhere. You know, I'm living right now in a very rural area. The nearest town is about 6 or 7 miles away, 2,500 people. It's Trump territory. You can tell by the lawn signs. But we had a Black Lives Matter demonstration in town. Incredible. And not only in Millerton, the nearest town, but in the next town in Pine Plains as well. So the movement, you know, notwithstanding partisan preferences and stuff like that, the movement is reaching deep into American society, deeper than any movement in my life experience.
I should say that's of some consequence. Francis Fox Piven is, if not the leading, one of the most important thinkers and analysts of social movements that we have. And in fact, in a certain way, she helped introduce the study of them as independent phenomena. So that's quite a statement. Let me ask you though, you said that this is unprecedented and the most remarkable thing you've seen. You know, in a certain way, your work anticipates this kind of movement, and also many that came before it, like Occupy Wall Street. I guess my question is, outside of the sheer size of it and the reach, what do you see as making it so special?
Well, it is the first deeply interracial movement that we have seen in the United States. And it's true that there were aspects of the civil rights movement that were interracial, but that was limited, and it was always filled with tension too. There was a lot of stress in the relations between Black and white activists in the civil rights movement. Not now, not now. It is unbelievable the way in which young Black and white people have, in a sense, embraced each other, locked arms, and they're marching together. And I can't think of another time when this happened on this scale. There was some interracial activism in the labor movement, some in the civil rights movement, not much in the anti-war movement. But in this movement, it's thoroughly interracial. And there doesn't seem to be any devastating stress between Black and brown and white people, young people in the movement. Now, it's true that there were a lot of a number of cultural changes in the United States that preceded this, that made it possible. But we're reaping the fruit of those cultural changes.
What do you see as the cultural changes?
Well, I think that these young people are very much the creatures of a kind of music culture and sports culture that is also deeply interracial and which celebrates Black and brown musicians and Black and brown sports stars. And so it's easy for young people, much easier than it is for the 50 or 60 or 70-year-olds who try also sometimes to hang on to the movement.
Indeed. Let me ask you, moving to this on a slightly different plane. How do you see the issue of identity playing out here? Because it seems to me, not so much within the movement, weirdly enough, but within academia, there is, or many perceive, a kind of intolerance and a shutting down of criticism and the shutting down of debates and a demand for a type of political conformity that seems to be taking place on many campuses. What do you think about that? Do you think this is actually, my sense is that it's actually removed from the movement itself, that this is
I don't
a
see
more
it
insular phenomenon? But I want to tell you.
affecting the movement. Although it may, movements go through phases, and this early phase of the movement can be so energized and so enthusiastic that the enthusiasm obliterates tensions, divisions, efforts at self-assertion that often splinter a movement later on. But at this point, I don't see it as really a problem at all.
Mm-hmm. The reason I mention it is because there was, I don't know if you saw this, there was in Harper's magazine a letter signed by about 150 people, many of them friends of ours and friends of yours, people like Noam Chomsky, Mirananda, was as brave a person as one wants to find. And this letter spoke about a new culture. Now, this is all academics. Spoke about a new culture of intolerance that's manifesting itself. The demand for conformity of speech, the demand for conformity of faculty, those that are hired, in terms of their interests, not simply in terms of their race or gender. I don't know, did you read this? And if so, it's gotten a lot of criticism on the left, but more for some of the people like J.K. Rowling, who signed it, she's of course critical of transgender people, than for the content. Did you look at this thing at all, or did you see it?
I didn't see it. I'm sorry, so I can't really react to it.
All right.
I think the problems of intolerance that we confront in this country have to do with white nationalism.
Yeah, I think that's the case also.
And that
primarily,
whatever, academics or wannabe academics become shrill and make mistakes. They can be pains in the asses, but that's not our problem. It's not a big problem in American political life.
I think it would be if there were, how should I put it, a greater connection between, shall we say, the more rigid intellectuals dealing with identity and the movement itself. And I think that's a danger. I mean, there's always this tendency to become defined by what one opposes. And I think that has to be raised among
I think that the
activists. Yeah,
intellectuals who are preoccupied with or obsessed by identity politics have had relatively little connection with the movement
yeah,
itself,
yeah. I think that's true.
relatively little influence on the movement. Uh, the movement, the movement basically asks that you pay great attention and more attention to the grievances of Black and Brown people because those grievances are, in human terms, more serious.
Hmm. Hmm.
And most reasonable people can see that.
Yeah, I have that sense also, but I think the cutting edge here is, if I can say so, I think class enters into this also in a big way, because it seems to me most of the supporters of Black Lives Matter are Black working class people. Um, I mean, they're the ones who have gone out, and it's not simply young people. It's also more established people, people with jobs, families, so on and so forth, and they seem to have been in the street as well. And the I think the reason for why I agree with you on the identity stuff is that the identity discussion it doesn't really speak to class, and it keeps the academic stuff very insulated.
But it doesn't seem to really matter. Uh,
Okay.
if you pursue a conversation with the people who I would regard as the intellectual spokespeople for the movement,
Mhm.
if you pursue a conversation about their grievances and what has to be done about them, I mean, it begins with police brutality,
Yeah.
but quickly moves to housing, earnings, neighborhoods, schools. Uh, and these are also people who know a lot about class and injuries of
Yeah.
class in the United States. So,
Um, I also think back to an old book that I'm sure you remember, which is Richard Sennett's The Hidden Injuries of Class. And I find that has a real relevance to this. People feel denied the, people feel the inequities of everyday life and its impact upon their opportunities and their and their possibilities for making changes. I think that's one of the things that struck me as particularly extraordinary about this present movement. There's a sense of almost psychological empowerment that's coming with this.
well, that's what movements do.
I'm sorry.
That's what movements do.
Yeah.
Movements are empowering. Movements exercise power, but they do it in part by empowering their recruits. And they do it, a lot of what we think of as the essence of movements, wrongly, I think, but nevertheless, that's like the common view, has to do with the sort of self-empowering, the chants, the songs, the banners, the marches. This isn't how movements become effective. It's how they build themselves, how they recruit, how they energize people. And then when in a sense, the collectivity is created by the movement, it can do what movements do distinctively, uniquely, and that is it can exercise the power of refusal. That's what movements do.
I want to
They,
go on a little bit. I know that's one of your central
yes.
themes in all your work. You want to talk about that a little more, the idea of refusal and
Well,
cooperation?
I think it's most recognizable. What I'm talking about is most recognizable by referring to the strike. Everybody understands what a strike is.
Mm-hmm.
Workers who are supposed to go to work every day and stand at the assembly line and make the machine come out at the end so that they can sell it and make profits. Workers withdraw their labor. That's a strike. They do it collectively and it's a strike. But, you know, we all make contributions in a complex society. We all make contributions to cooperative endeavors, not just by going to the factory, but by going to school, by raising the children, by crossing the streets at the light. In manifold ways, our society functions because we are cooperators. We follow the rules that are necessary in order for the cooperation to function, to create an institution which gives things to the society, to the collectivity. So because we all are part of these systems and we all play multiple roles in these systems, we all have potential strike power if we recognize that what we do is really essential. You know, if you look back at American movements historically, one of the things that movement organizers did, and the Wobblies were distinctive in this sense.
The international workers of the world, yes.
Yes, they tell people that what they do is important. The Wobblies had songs about this. It is we who till the prairies, build the cities where they reign. What was that about?
Right.
Not just a good song and camaraderie and things like that. It was a political lesson. And the political lesson, if it is we who till the prairies, build the cities where they reign, we are important to them. And we can use the important activities that we and only we do to make them do what we want. That's movement power.
I'm going to ask you something since we started with the Wobblies. One of the criticisms that comes, especially from more establishmentarian leftists and more orthodox leftists, is that the movement doesn't manifest enough discipline. It hasn't generated a self-sustaining quality. In other words, it'll pass and then perhaps another one will come up, raise different demands and reforms, but there's no structure to sustain them. I was thinking of, as you were talking about the IWW, there's that great line from Eugene Debs. No, I'm not going to be your leader, because if I led you to the promised land, there's surely going to be someone who leads you out. So I wonder how this is another theme of course, of your work. How do you deal with the question of discipline? Is it a legitimate criticism, or is it, you think, off base?
Well, I think it's off base, because discipline for what? I mean, the call for discipline has to be based on some idea of how to make people at the bottom politically effective. Mm. And making them politically effective is not accomplished by signing them up for an organization, for example, or getting them to pay dues every week, or getting those sorts of activities don't directly connect with politically effective actions. Political effectiveness has to be connected to that strike power that I talked about a couple of minutes before. It has to have to do with getting people to withdraw their cooperation in order to force elites to make concessions or to step aside so as to permit transformative forces to reign unimpeded. So, and you know, the idea that, oh, you're going to be a flash in the pan. You're going to call the crowd out. The crowd will be in the street. They'll shout, they'll yell, they'll have a moment of joy and exuberance, and then it will all be over. That is not right. that is historically inaccurate. Movements last a pretty long time. Look at how long the labor movement has lasted. Look at how long the civil rights movement lasted. Movements have dominated large portions of American history, and they're not flash in the pan at all. So, and if you look at the organizations, formal organizations that are often created in the wake of the emergence of movements, they don't last long at all. Look at the movement, the organizations that came out of the poor people's movements of the 1960s and the early 1970s. They're pretty much gone by now. So, you know, in principle, organizations last forever. But there are two questions. Is that true? The other is, and what can they do? Because one of the ways in which they do last as long as they do is by serving functions for elites so that they get foundation and government grants.
Very noble enterprise, I must say. I'd like to close with one other question, which I'm sure is raised all the time. We are facing an election. Now, very often, radicals will say, you make your choice between the movement and voting. My own view is that the two are not mutually exclusive, that following, building on one of the points you make, I forget which book, there's a fundamental difference between what parties and what movements do. Parties legislate, movements pressure. But the distinction between, and it really doesn't matter to the movement whether you vote or you don't. In fact, it could help. But the question is, now a decisive election's coming up. And there's, of course, the possibility of overconfidence and the like. But what do you say about the vote?
Well, I think that that's a false opposition. It is true that there have been periods when a lot of activists say you choose the electoral path or you choose the movement path, that if you choose the electoral path, your movement work will be co-opted. And there's a little bit of truth to that. You know, if you get to be the alderman in your little town or your big town, you're going to work at being an alderman and you're not going to want to do the movement. And you may even try to suppress the movement work because it's going to make people mad. Mm-hmm. So there's some truth in that, but there's a much larger and more important truth in the way in which movement work and electoral work complement each other. Mm-hmm. It is extremely important in understanding the labor movement of the 1930s, for example, that we had a New Deal Democratic Party as the dominant party in the federal government. That gave the activists a lot of courage, a lot of morale that they otherwise would not have had. And it also is true that as the strike movement of the 1930s expanded and intensified, there were Democrats in the Congress and in the White House who could translate those grievances into legislation. So the same thing happened in the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. The civil rights movement, you know, a lot of people said at the time, you're either a movement activist or you work in electoral politics and the two shall never come together. But in fact, Martin Luther King didn't think that. LBJ didn't think that. And they both understood perfectly well that what LBJ could get through the Congress in the way of civil rights legislation or the Voting Rights Act depended on the movement. Now, it's true that as president, the leader of the Democratic Party, LBJ wished they would stop. I mean, he wished they would slow down, they would leave him alone because they made trouble for him. But that trouble is what made LBJ the president who said, "We shall overcome," in one of his great official speeches. He echoed the anthem of the civil rights movement.
Francis Fox Piven, it's been a pleasure having you on. Always enlightening, and you're just a delight. I wish you all the best. Again, I'm Stephen Bronner. I'm the co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, who sponsored this program, this contribution to the crisis. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll tune in to other shows. Thank you, Fran.